back to it. So welcome to At the Table with AACC, or the Asian American Christian Collaborative. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions where Asian American Christian leaders and pastors are able to draw from their experiences, their expertise, and their education to discuss questions and topics and issues that impact the Asian American Christian community and church at large. We're here today at the historic Chinese Community Church of Washington, D.C., located in the heart of Chinatown in our nation's capital. The church was founded in 1935 and is the only Chinese church in D.C. proper. We'll be talking about navigating church in the post-COVID era, exploring the challenges and opportunities in a world that has dramatically changed. I'm excited to be here with all of my esteemed friends and guests. My name is Ray Chang, and I get to serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Carl Park. I'm a pastor at Great Commission Community Church in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm also faculty at a school of worship called the Institute for Worship Studies.
Brian Lee. I'm from New Covenant Fellowship Church. I've been serving there for 18 years now at the English congregation.
Hugo Cheng, currently the senior pastor of the Chinese Bible Church in Maryland.
So glad to be with all of you. Well, let's dive right into it. COVID's had quite an impact on all of us. From what I've been hearing, it's impacted attendance, it's impacted how people engage with community, it's impacted how people serve and volunteer. It's impacted giving, sometimes going up, sometimes going down. I'm not sure what happened with your churches, so I'd be curious if you saw the trend upwards or downwards. It's impacted how pastors view their own work and their own level of exhaustion, and even questions about burnout, something that many of the congregants don't know that pastors are facing as they were having to do all the regular duties, but also having to learn how to navigate the technology of Zoom and other things like that. What have you seen as a result of the pandemic in your churches?
Very difficult, confusing, a lot of changes. We just had to constantly adapt to new changes and relearn, refocus, a lot of meetings, trying to find creative ways to reach the people, how to get people, how do we define our community. That was one of the biggest changes for our church.
Can you say more about that?
So the way that we kind of operated in the beginning of our church, or until before COVID, was we're one church, we have Korean congregation, we have English congregation. It was very like inward focus. At the same time, we did a lot of missions overseas and things like that. But then we weren't really active in our community. Like, we're located in Germantown. So during COVID, we couldn't send missions teams anymore. We couldn't do a lot of things. People weren't coming out to church. So we started to ask questions like why they got put us in Germantown, and what is the demographic of Germantown, which is a lot of immigrants, immigrant families, a lot of non-Americans. So that was actually a one awakening moment for our church in particular, that we kind of redefined our community. It wasn't just Korean Americans anymore, it was just Asian Americans anymore. So I had to go through that change of like, can I actually be a pastor to non-Asians? That was a big challenge for me as a Korean American. Like, can I actually do that?
How'd you process that?
At the end of the day, I had to have the conviction from God to say like, hey, why not? If Paul can do to non-Jews, that was actually a breakthrough moment for me. Like, can a Korean person who immigrated to America, who's not even a native speaker, can I actually be a pastor to a multicultural congregation? The answer was yes to God, but it took me a while to even accept that.
So you're saying you were internally wrestling with whether you were equipped to reach them, not so much whether you wanted to reach. It's not because you didn't want to reach them, it's whether you felt adequate.
Yes. Like, do I qualify? Like, do I need to look like them? Because long time ago we used to talk about, okay, we need to hire white American pastor or like African American pastor so we can be relevant to people. But then we started to question, like, do we really need to do that to become multicultural? Or can I just be who I am and still minister to people that God sends to our way? So that was one of the biggest breakthrough moments for me during COVID. Yeah.
Wow,
yeah.
big breakthrough.
Yeah.
For us, kind of again, a mixed bag, right? We of course, people all went home, right, and everything went online. And then when it reopened, getting people back, we thankfully our church, back to pretty much the original number, but not with all the original people. Lot of new people come in, and a lot of people are still staying online, and because we see that. But then I think one of the good thing for our church is that before the pandemic, because we're a slightly larger church, we have lots of programs. I mean, it's just sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. And sometimes I think, and I've been harping on, we got to focus, we need to. And a lot of people, the deacons, the volunteers will say, yeah, Pastor, you're right, we should focus, we should cut some program. Just don't cut my program, And so pandemic kind of put a hard stop to that, right? And then so we can kind of pause, have to pause. But then it gave us the time, the elders, the pastors, and others to really pray and discuss, okay, so what can we do right now during the pandemic and also after the pandemic, what should we really focus on? So I thought that was the good part. Really got us back to focus really on prayer, on the basics of prayer, evangelism, and discipleship, really.
So that's actually helpful. So what are some, like, maybe we could press into that. What are some of the things that you felt like people didn't want to give up, that you asked them to give up? How did you make those decisions in terms of like what you prioritized and decided? What was the rubric in terms of your decision making?
Well, I think first, as I said, the pandemic did that for us. Right? It just stopped, everything. So I didn't have to tell them to stop. The pandemic stopped, right? So now we're kind of back to. So one funny example we give our church is we have these bulletin boards, right? Electronic ones as well as the old-fashioned ones, cork boards, right? It used to be I walk by, it's plastered with flyers. Sometimes it looks like in New York. I used to work in Manhattan. You walk by, there's like flyer over flyer plaster, right? It looked like that. And then some of the people in our church are proud of that. Like, look at how many programs we have. But every time I look at it, I just like, oh man, so many programs, too many programs, right? And then when pandemic hit, the board's cleared. It's clean, okay? So then we can sit down and say, okay, at this time, what are the, sometimes driven by needs, right? Okay, there are senior citizens, there are people who are in need during the pandemic. So of course, going to see them if they're willing to have us visit them, or buying grocery for them, or just help them set up their Zoom account so that they can join us online. Those become a priority. But then other than that, we say, okay, even though we're online, or now we're slowly coming back, I think prayer, one of the things I think our church have always been is resource rich and prayer poor. Okay? And something maybe because we're resource rich, so we became prayer poor. And I'm not talking about just having a lot of prayer programs either, but just really seeking God together, corporate prayer, crying out to God. And so in some sense, prayer meeting online made it easier. So actually one of the things we saw an uptick was that our various prayer meetings, a lot more people joined because they can join online rather than in person. But then, the prayer was much more intense and passionate during COVID. And then after, that kind of, I think, kept up. People just got used to coming to the online prayer, although now we're trying to move it back in person prayer. I'm not sure how that's going to work. But prayer for sure, because the pandemic helped us to really realize we really need to be dependent on God, right? And then other things, like I said, evangelism. I think we also started right before pandemic, we were exploring a particular evangelism tool. It's called the Happiness Group. It's kind of like a Chinese version of Alpha. And so that lends itself to be online. So we started a bunch of them, saw people coming to Christ online left and right. So that just kind of carried on. We just felt, reaching out, like you said, reaching out locally to the people around us. And then discipleship, because as these people come to Christ, they have to be rooted in Christ and grow. And then, we have all wanted to really help them and help others to grow in Christ. So discipleship, also online at the time, to become a priority. So those three kind of came up.
That's really good. I mean, so the fact that there is a tension between being resource rich and prayer poor, that does seem to be a consistent theme that we see over and over. I am curious if we pressed in just a little bit about what increased the fervor. What increased the fervor beyond just the fact that we were in a pandemic? Was there a particular aspect of being in a pandemic that you said that you saw led to deeper and more kind of earnest prayer? Or was it the sicknesses? Was it the fact that people felt lonely? Was it the fact that people were losing their jobs? What was going on that you feel like had them press into prayer a little more?
I think in our case, it's all the above. We have people losing their job. We have not many people are being sick yet, but they have relatives and friends. And I think there's fear, right? Natural fear humans have. But then but I think also it's the leadership. I think we as the leadership really have been working hard even prior to pandemic to really help our church to grow in prayer, especially corporate prayer, and been teaching it, modeling it, and mobilizing it. So with the pandemic, in some sense, help, because when they have fear, instead of just be paralyzed by the fear or go to other places, other ways to alleviate the fear, we say, well, okay, bring your fear, because God wants us to bring our fear to Him, and so I think the leadership was really also trying hard to direct them to prayer, so.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, one word that comes to mind when I think about, this COVID period that we're still, in or coming out of, is community. And I think initially, our church is, demographically, we skew pretty young. And, most of the people in our congregation and the people sort of right outside of our circles, they, largely professionals, and so moving to online church wasn't that difficult. Well, that's what they're doing every day with their work anyway. But I think in terms of the church community, just initially, especially being isolated, and then I think coming to kind of our worship on Sunday, where there was an active chat and people were perhaps texting each other during the service, and that sense of being together even though we were online, it was really rich, and it was so great to be together. I think that petered out over time. It's just hard to maintain that, especially when those sort of interactive elements are not as strong, and especially when a bunch of people are back in person and you're one of not that many who are participating online. But I think it's caused people, and maybe I'm hoping it's caused people to think about how important a faith community is to their walk with Christ. And I think, especially in America, in the West generally, we are trained to be individualistic and maybe hyper individualistic. And even when it comes to church, again, my congregation skews younger. And I think, I don't know, I guess it applies to older people as well, but kind of across the board, I think there's this mentality in church or church circles where it's sort of like me and Jesus. And even coming to church on a Sunday for a service, it's sort of like, if let's say there's 100 people there, it's all 100 of us having our sort of one-on-one me and Jesus experiences. Sort of like a computer lab. We're all in the same room, but we're all doing our own thing, sort of together. And just thinking about, is that what we're really going for? Is that what this is supposed to be, or what is this supposed to look like? And I think COVID has shown us, I think, that's not sufficient. And just tuning into a podcast, hey, it's a good sermon from somebody online or a book or something. It's not the same as being together in a community, having this encounter with the Holy Spirit together. And I guess one challenge of the COVID era has been an attendance thing. And even with people coming back in person, I feel like it's a little bit weaker. Just numbers are just a little bit lower generally. I think a challenge is for our people to give themselves to a community where perhaps in COVID, they're like, well, I can sort of make do on my own, even though it's not that great. It's not that great, but it's sort of doable. Kind of helping those people sort of navigate it with a community and say, and saying to them, encouraging them somehow to say, yeah, I need a community. It can't be just a me and Jesus sort of spirituality that I live out. Like, that's not really sustainable, and it's not that robust. And so I feel like, yeah, in that way, this COVID era has sort of put a spotlight on that. And, you know, again, I say, like, hopefully making people think hard about, yeah, you know, I really need to be invested in a community, but I think that's a challenge of our time, because, yeah, the isolating effect of COVID has been very real.
That's good. I mean, you know, there are questions now about how we navigate our faith. And the model of Jesus was to bring people into community. He didn't just go after one disciple and then had an individual relationship with that person and then the next disciple, but he brought them into a community. One of the major things I hear from pastors all throughout the country is this challenge around attendance that you brought up. It seems like it used to be, you know, a normal or an average churchgoer would show up 2 to 3 times a month before the pandemic. Do you feel like that's true within Asian American communities, or was the numbers higher? And then now, after the pandemic, it seems like and this is like kind of like a broader kind of cross-racial survey, but I don't know if we have enough data to know if this is actually the consistent thing with Asian Americans. Post-pandemic, the broader kind of information seems to be that the average attendance is about once a month. And so a lot of pastors that I'm speaking with are saying to me, like, they're not able to kind of disciple people through preaching because they're missing so many weeks. And so they could essentially preach the same sermon 4 times in a month, and it'll be new for the majority of the congregation every single month. What that also means is that they think that their congregations are far larger than they are, because if there's 300 people that's showing up any given week, it could be that the congregation is probably closer to 900, but we don't really know because we don't know what that overlap is. And several pastors that I've spoken to said they asked people, like, who was here last week, who was here the week before? And like, it was less than 20%. Are you seeing something similar? How are you are you having to navigate that? How are you navigating that?
Well, for our church, so I mean, there's a lot of points in your questions.
And I would be curious how that affects, especially like the Chinese, Korean, multi-ethnic,
yeah,
you know, Asian-led type of churches as well.
So for our church, because we have had live stream for years, because you know, we have a lot of senior citizens and we have a lot of, you know, IT geek nerd, you know, great, you know, brothers and sisters. So they have set up this live stream and they hired a professional company. So it's been there, and they can track, you know, who's online, how many units, how many individuals, and so on. You know, so we had that for years before the pandemic. So that helped. But then, so because of that, we can kind of track who's been coming, who's online. But in terms of your question, for us, I think post-pandemic, you know, we have people, you know, our numbers is growing back up, but a lot of newcomers. Some of the people who have been in our church are coming still online. You know, so for us, it's not so much they show up only once a month, but they show up, maybe they haven't shown up back in person yet, or they show up once in a month in person. But the other time, most of them are online, because I get email, you know, again, our church, we have a number of people who, well, I guess I'm thankful that they're listening. You know, sometimes they email as an encouragement, hey, I really appreciate your sermon. Or sometimes they'll be like, you know, hey, you know, I'm not sure I agree with what you said there, but at least they're listening, right? You know, so I know people are online listening. So it's not like, so I cannot sort of preach the same sermon because they heard my sermon even though they were online. So it's more the online versus in person, even though they're always there. But the problem with the online part is also, some of them are pretty honest. They're like, hey, you know, I like being online because I have my coffee, I'm in my pajamas. Sometimes I put you on pause. I can go to grab my breakfast and do some work while I'm listening to you. Like, they would never do that in person, right? But now I think they're developing some new habits that I'm not so sure are good also. So.
Yeah, I think for our church, I think everyone who were committed. So I think there are different categories of people. So I think there are people who came pretty early on. We opened our church very early. because we fortunately we have a big space where we were able to safely meet, so we opened early. And the first third, I guess, the really committed people came out, we're all spread out. But then it's the second group, people who are like not as committed. They would miss Sunday here and there before, but now during the pandemic, as like Korean Americans or Asians, sometimes you just go to church because your parents told you to do so. You just feel kind of like you're not doing something right by not going to church. But all of a sudden, pandemic just gave you that excuse to, oh, it's okay to miss. I'll just catch up, or I'll just watch like while I drive or go on vacation. That trend is still there, actually. Even throughout the summer, a lot of people go. That can be a good thing and a challenging thing because, hey, they're still engaged with church, they're watching the service, but then they're making those choices. They go on more vacations, they miss church a lot more now. Like, oh, I don't feel like going today. My kids are not ready. Like, let's just watch at home. So there's that group. But then we have a lot of people who all of a sudden just started to come to church. I think they crave that in person. So I think what you say kind of makes sense because I see so many new people. I think this past year, like our newcomer team was the busiest ministry because every week people are just coming and just looking for church. And I think COVID kind of gave them to reevaluate their church involvement, wanted to find the church for their kids, and in a way kind of gave them like a way out of their current church without feeling like, oh, like, Pastor, I'm gonna leave, but they don't even have to do that anymore. They can just go check out different churches. So I see that happening. I'm not so sure whether I can speak same message every week. It's not to that extent, but we do have that. Because, you know, like even me as a Korean American, my parents would be like, how dare you miss church? Yeah. But now, even me as a pastor, I've got to, you know, I'm a little bit more comfortable seeing like people, okay, you're gonna miss, okay, you know where to find the live stream, you know? So it's kind of weird, like a wrestling thought in my mind. I don't like it, but then I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think similarly, I don't know if I could, preach the same sermon.
I think that was a little bit of a hyperbole. Yeah. So, I was like, it's more of the hyperbole, but yes.
Yeah, but definitely that's there. But I think that sounds accurate, like pre-pandemic, 2 to 3 times a month. Now, maybe a little bit less. I don't know about once a month or less, but there probably are people like that. It's probably kind of different groups of people. The group that I'm, I guess, most concerned about pastorally are the people who took COVID as an opportunity to drift a little bit from the community. And I think even if it wasn't intentional, like a drift from the community as well as a drift from Christ, I think, or a life from Christ. And I think since sort of people are back in person and so on, there are some of those people who have come back, but then there are other people who have not. And we check in on them here and there. There might be stories of, oh, I'm actually checking out another church. They're going to, your church, I guess. I'm just kidding. But I mean, that's great. I mean, if they can find a place, that's great. Obviously, God bless them. And if there are people, though, who are, churchless, and they're just sort of doing their own thing. And again, I think trying to navigate this world, navigate life, and sort of maintaining, I'm a Christian, even though I'm not really part of a church. I'm pretty sure I'm a Christian still. I just think that's really hard to sustain without, I think it's perhaps impossible to sustain. It just wasn't designed to work like that without a community and like a meaningful participation in a community. And so I think that's a group I'm most concerned about pastorally, and hopefully, there are ways that we'll see them.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, so Asian Americans, obviously we're not, we have a limitation in our diversity at this room because we don't span the whole kind of spectrum of Asian America. But one of the major challenges we faced during the pandemic was the rise of overt anti-Asian sentiment and violence and racism. How did that impact your communities? how did you navigate that? What was the result of how you navigated that? Did people stay? Did people leave? Were they comforted by how you addressed it? You didn't address it, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Ram, yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I feel like when we talk about the COVID era, I mean, we're not just talking about a virus. We're talking about larger issues. We're talking about, individualism. We're talking about politics. We're talking about race. Just in terms of race, I know something that our church did during the pandemic was we developed like a race and justice ministry team, basically a group of people who are championing these issues for our whole congregation. And kind of as that was happening, I know in 2020, one of our Sunday services online was just a lament for the Black community. And then after the shootings in Georgia, we had a lament for the Asian American community. And that was really interesting. I mean, I think it was really a great time, and it was a time for us to, as our church is like largely Asian American, and I hesitate to call ourselves an Asian American church, but it's demographically largely Asian American. And I think what we found there was that Asian Americans have a hard time expressing what they're feeling, or even knowing what to feel. And this uncertainty about what should I be feeling, and what should I be thinking, what should I be saying. And it was funny with the lament for the Black community. I asked people to contribute, hey, here's our liturgy, can you give me suggestions, over the weeks prior to that. Got tons of response. And then when it was time for the lament for the Asian American community, a lot of responses were like, I'd like to help, I'm just not sure I'm at the right place. I'm not sure if I know what to say or how to feel about things. And so, that drove home for me this need for, I think, just Asian Americans to have a sense of, like a communal script almost, like, and even just like cultural voices to express our feelings, to express our emotions, to express our history, as well as just straight up, boy, we really need to know our history. And a significant part of that lament service was actually just a little, like a prayerful lamenting of Asian American history, kind of scenes of Asian American history. And I feel like for many of our people, they just didn't know a lot of those scenes. And I think it would be great for just going forward for that to be something that continues to grow, like our knowledge of our history, as well as just a growing confidence and a type of sureness about, hey, these are good feelings for us to have, and we can express these, and they're legitimized and so on.
I will say, it does seem like of all the major racial groups, Asian Americans have the hardest time deciding and deciphering if they're allowed to feel what they feel and what to think about how they are perceived and racialized in our society. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I mean, I think a big kind of force is the model minority myth, which basically says, put away anything that makes you distinctly Asian, become a type of Asian that kind of puts your head down, works hard, fits into the broader culture, offers no distinction that might rock the boat, and that leads to a type of like deep self-erasure and invisibilization. The other thing is that we're just tired of being treated like constant and perpetual foreigners, right? And so like those are things that we feel like we have to suppress, even if we're being discriminated against or prejudiced and experience racism, so that we're not drawing attention to ourselves for the wrong things. And so I mean, what you're saying is spot on, and I'd be curious what the others have experienced.
It's kind of interesting because our church during COVID, I guess in the beginning we used to do visual like when the whole like Black Lives Matter, all that came out, we realized we didn't know what to do. So we started to kind of have the attitude of wanting to learn and to listen. You know, there was all the movement, either that or like you like go against it. But we started to try to learn. And then when it came to like Asian American hatred, I just felt like we don't want to like put spotlight on ourselves. I just felt like even as a pastor, I would have no issue making announcements. We even did like a book study on the color of compromise just to learn and grow together. But then, like, do we do a class on like Asian hatred? Or do we just talk to our kids? You know, I did talk to my kids as people who look like Asians, but then even our kids and even myself, I feel like it goes back to the identity crisis. Like, are we Asians? Are we Americans? Like, where do we really fit in? And when we talk about these things, are we like pointing to ourselves and is this okay to do that? So in a way, I just felt like I didn't have the right to even like make such an announcement. But then it's interesting because a lot of our young people at our church, they will bring up all these issues like, why don't you mention that? I mean, last time you talked about this issue, why don't you talk about this? And when I heard that, I was like, you're right, I should, but you know, something in me just,
What do you think it was? How would you articulate what that was? Because it's such a common thing.
Yeah.
And I have my kind of thoughts on that, but it's really helpful when people kind of share what's going on internally.
I feel like, I don't know, I mean, I'm a 1.5 generation. I immigrated when I was 13 from Korea, so that's a general conflict that I have a lot of times. Like, do I fit in here? Do I fit in there? Am I allowed to even voice this? Are people gonna judge me? I think there's a lot of that too. Like when I say this, are people gonna say like, oh yeah, your struggle is nothing. Like, look at all these like Black people getting like treated this and that, and like your issue is not as big, or something like that. Maybe personally, like can I actually say that and not be criticized? And kind of like going back to the whole modern minority myth, like let's just kind of like deal with it quietly. Like talk to my kids at home. So that was my personal struggle. I can't really like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I can articulate my thoughts, but that's a lot of like struggle. Like,
That's good.
Yeah, I think for us it's similar because I think back when the whole Black Lives Matters and so on happened. I think I counted we preached not all in one shot, but probably a series of sermons, about 25 sermons on it, you know, and different aspect of it. But I don't think we preached one sermon on Asian American hate, you know, and so on, you know, and maybe for similar reasons. But again, I'm not sure we necessarily did this right or wrong, because I really appreciate the things that your church practiced, but that's kind of not our church culture, at least at this time. So what kind of got us through that? Actually, I think certainly there's the fears, and then we joined. I think some of the AACC marches or gatherings. You know, we participated in. And then people who have some of the concern about, you know, what if someone, you know, attacked them because they're Asian. So they did come to us privately, you know, for counseling and so on, right? But overall, it wasn't a big message. Now, among the staff, we talk quite a bit about that, and I think maybe the staff had more support because we had about staff team about 10, you know, and then we meet every week and we pray for each other. So I think we probably were better taken care of because we're in that team and we talked more freely about how we feel and so on. But I think for our church, what kind of got us, I think, through it, and in a good way, it goes back to what you were saying earlier, is also just a general fear on COVID. I think, and also what you were saying, during COVID, there's not only the fear of COVID, but there is also the tension and the divisiveness from the politics, from other things that are happening. And so we as the staff, we talked about that. And we felt like at least we concluded that there's two messages only, or mainly, that we want to give out during this time. You know, I know all churches have kind of their annual theme, and sometimes it looks good on banner or T-shirt, but you know, we really try to drive home. So we decided that right from the beginning of COVID and all the way through for a couple of years, our theme was Christ alone. You know, and we really tried to, in our preaching, in our counseling, in, you know, it's so we send out a message. It's not about necessarily, what we're experiencing, even though we want to validate that and affirm. But really, COVID and all of this should call us back to that there's no solution in this world that can really help. And our allegiance is to Christ, not to my Asianness, not to anything else, but it's to Christ. Now, it applies and live out in my Asianness, but really.
What does that look like? Because that's the big question, and I want you to continue, but what does it look like for our allegiance to be in Christ and that to apply to our Asian Americanness?
That's a whole nother topic that we.
But just like if you could touch on that.
Yeah. Should I go back to that or?
No, you can do either or. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just finish that. So the two things that I think really helped was Christ alone was our message, and we tried to really kind of permeate that in everything we do during those times to help people to always come back to Christ. Okay, you guys don't agree in politics? Well, come back to the gospel, to Jesus. That unites us, and then from that point, how do we look at each other, when we differ? And then the other thing really related to that is that, okay, instead of kind of just either be in fear or complaining about what people might do to us or might not do to us, let's be proactive. Even as Christians or as Asian Christians, that during pandemic, we should actually, because we actually talked out about during the Black Death or so on, the Christians gave their lives to help others, right? So we try to really either online or in person proactively help our people during pandemic to be much more proactive about helping, whether it's, delivering food, we actually had a lot of people sign up to meet online on a weekly basis with the missionaries that we support out in the Middle East or other places. So we're actually teaching their kids English, or some lady started online choir with the missionary kids, so the missionary kids have something to do, and then we befriend them. Like I met with the missionary couple every week on Zoom, just to see how they're doing, get to know them better, teach them English because they're from another country, and so I think we want to help our people to be actually more outward focused, to say, I mean, maybe that's also, may not be fully healthy, that, maybe we're avoiding like looking inwardly, but we just felt like during the pandemic time, Christ alone, and then, proactively sacrifice ourselves to serve other people. That might be the best way to erase some of the misunderstanding and hate, rather than, hate back or just kind of shelter ourselves. Let's be proactive and serve them, right? Christ says, love your enemies. So let's go out and love everybody and love our enemies more proactively, and maybe that will actually counter the hate that's out there. So that's the two things that we really try to emphasize, and it seemed to ground our people's mind and hearts better, So
that's great.
Yeah.
And so, how do you feel like? So going back to that one question, if you had like a quick insight into, how do we devote our lives wholly and fully to Jesus, and fixate on Him, and what does that mean, and how does that apply to our Asian American identity?
I guess it is a huge topic, but as quickly as two things that we tend to try to do in our discussion, preaching, or Sunday school, or small group discussions, is both on the positive and the negative side. Positively, okay, so how did God, since God gifted us and created the Asian culture, or the Chinese culture in our case, right? What are the things in our culture that can be particularly, we can use in a positive way to serve Christ or follow Christ? But then also, we also talk about, well, there are also things within our Chinese culture or Asianness that kind of hinders, that goes counter against what the gospel teaches. Like, we're a very strong shame and honor culture, right? And so a lot of time we intentionally, unintentionally shaming people or guilt trip people, or our motives are more are not as gospel aligned. So we also talked about that. Okay, so these parts of our culture need to be changed by the gospel. These part of the culture we need to use it to promote the gospel. So that's something we try to proactively think about and talk about. So.
If I can just jump in, I think when it comes to living in Christ, like in these particular bodies with these particular faces and last names and so on, I think theologically you always point to the incarnation and Jesus taking on our flesh, and our flesh is very important. And as well, when we follow Christ, we don't follow Christ sort of like historically they would call it like gnostically, like as if our bodies don't matter and it's just about our souls and our bodies are secondary or not important at all. And so I think a lot of it is not living in Christ as sort of like a culture neutral person, but like as a community, as an individual, saying like, yeah, how does Jesus come to me as I am in my agent? Like, how does he know my experience? And you know, understanding like, oh, when I feel like an other, yeah, I have this special communion with Jesus. And I think similarly, as we aspire to like be one with Christ, kind of likewise, you know, and I think that's where we can have empathy for other people, where we're not just finding a refuge in Christ, but we're giving refuge to others. But I think just how important it is to know, yeah, our bodies really matter, and our ethnicities matter, our faces and last names, like really, like as we follow Christ, we're not just sort of bodiless souls who are following Christ, but these particularities really matter. And I think bringing those to, like, very intentionally, even praying like, God, you see us when we are treated as the other. Like, you see us when we are, when acts of violence are committed against us. You see us when we're ignored. You see us when we are misunderstood, and so on. And I think that's really important for us to own as Christians. And I think that makes a big difference in how we follow Christ, you know. And I think that's one of the, I guess, a difficulty or a hole in. So I think sometimes when, especially Asian American Christians, I would say, we feel sort of this unspoken pressure to assimilate into not just like kind of a white America, but a white American Christian kind of world. And sort of like, well, it doesn't really matter that I'm Asian American. We're just we're just, you know, like we're just souls almost, you know, and just missing the chance to experience Christ in that way, you know, in our particularities. And I think in that way, the gospel only goes so far if that's where we stop, you know, if we don't let ourselves experience Christ's oneness with us in that. And so I think that's, I guess, a theological sort of answer to your question, Ray. Yeah. But I know for me, it's been, and I think for our community, you know, it's really important to like address those particularities and to realize, yeah, how real Christ is in these very specific experiences that we have.
Yeah, that's good. Did you want to respond to it as well?
Just to kind of go back to the point, like embracing who we are. Kind of like my story about how I had to just embrace who I am and be okay with who I am and understand that God can still use me in that sense. I don't have to look like that. Because, you know, our church went through a long period of like many years before COVID. Like, aren't we supposed to be multicultural? Like, how can we become multicultural? And that was constantly talked about. And the question was like, what does that even look like? How do we get there? And a lot of times the answers are, okay, we bring in different staff. We need to have representation, which is, to a certain extent, it's right. But then is that how we become multicultural? But I think through COVID, God just naturally brought us together, different people from different ethnicity background and things like that. So just being okay with who we are and embracing who we are as Asian Americans or African Americans. So in that sense, I think, I would think personally, I think that's what we'll need to have the allegiance to Christ and still be okay with who I am and embrace fully what I'm called to be. Because I think because I'm a Korean American, there are a lot of ministries that we were able to do. I went through ESL. So like when I came back from missions, I say, okay, I went through ESL, I benefited a lot from ESL, and I know what these immigrant families are going through. So let's do ESL at our church. And, you know, that was kind of like the mindset that God all of a sudden, you know, kind of gave me. Hey, you know what to do. You understand the pains of what immigrants go through every day. So why don't you use that as an advantage, not shy away from it, but use that as an advantage that God gave you as a tool to serve the people. So that's kind of like how my brain works these days.
That's
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And so we're going to round out our time together, but I kind of have a compound question. And the compound question is, it seems like there is a chasm in understanding between how congregants think about what their pastors are experiencing post-pandemic and what pastors' expectations, hopes, frustrations, desires for the congregants are in the pandemic. And a lot of it comes down to attendance, service, and so on and so forth. That's one piece. So I'd be curious if you can speak into that. The other question I'm curious about is, in light of the kind of the chasm and the two populations that we're addressing, what are the pros that came out of the pandemic, and what are the cons that we need to really wrestle with? And can you offer a word of encouragement or exhortation or charge to whoever might be listening in as we move forward? Because we're recording this when COVID is again spiking. And so it's not over. I mean, we're not calling it a pandemic anymore. I don't think we're calling it an epidemic, but I am hearing about there were supposed to be people that were part of this that couldn't make it because of COVID. And so the chasm between pastors and congregants, how do we bridge the understanding gap? What do we need to see happening? Pros and cons from the pandemic, and a word of encouragement.
I mean, if I can speak up, I would say just keep on doing what you're doing. Because one day I was preaching and kind of being frustrated or like wanting people to just come to church more regularly and things like that. And then my wife, after the sermon, she pulled me aside and said, just preach to the people who are here. Like, why are you constantly trying to get people who are not coming? And I knew what she was saying. Don't stress so much over people who you can't get right now. Like, work with people who are here. And eventually, it's God who can change people. It's not you. And you're stressing over all these things that you just don't have grip over. So basically, she was saying, get over it. Stop living in this COVID mindset. Like, people are here. There are hundreds of people in front of you, but a lot of times I think we have these people who are not coming out, the pockets of people listening at home. A lot of my messages are directed towards them, like, come to church, you gotta be plugged into community. And my wife, being the wise one, she's like, just talk to the people here. And that was actually a very good teaching moment for me. So I would just encourage other pastors to not do what I did, but really focus on what God brought together. Those people who will eventually come, God has to move them. I can't really squeeze them to come to church. So maybe not stress over attendance so much, but maybe there will come a time. And actually, as church leadership, we had to go through this phase. Who do we focus on? We can't reach everybody. So we got to a point where one of the pros was kind of redefining who are our congregation, who are the committed people. So we started to kind of ask these questions. Who are we going to focus on? Not that we don't care about people who are not coming out to church. Definitely we need to care for every single person that God brings to us. But then can we do that? Or do we need to kind of make use of our time more wisely, our resources more focused on people that we should focus on, so that those people can hopefully go out and reach other people that should reach? So yeah, one of the things that we are doing right now is actually discipleship. We realize how shallow people are. Because as a pastor, I thought people were in a better place. They're coming out to prayer meetings and taking all these tracks of people, things that we laid out for them. But then when COVID happened, all of a sudden they just got all wiped out, and I realized they're not as firm in their faith as I expected. So one of the things that we're kind of redeveloping is okay, what does discipleship look like post-COVID? More individual based, more like how Jesus did. We can't constantly preach to the hundreds. We got to focus on the 12. We got to focus on the 3, and then they will go out and change the world. So I think that's one of the biggest lessons and pros that we kind of walked away from COVID. Yeah.
A wise spouse.
Yes.
There's something in Proverbs that says,
Thank you, Brian, for that encouragement, or to your wife. Thank you. I think just to sort of piggyback on that, I think one of the perhaps the ways that God is refining the church is, I don't know, I think a lot of our concerns, even the things that, we started our conversation about with listing, it's almost part of a organization building and part of the church industry, more or less. Are those of central concern? I mean, obviously we have pastoral concern for people, but just in terms of hitting a certain number or hitting a certain number on the spreadsheet or a number in an attendance form and so on. And maybe it's a way of being refined and taking some of our focus off those industry markers and onto kind of markers that seem more important to Christ, more consistent with the way he lived and did ministry. And so I think I would say that's a positive, and I do feel like the church, maybe across the world, but definitely in North America, but we need a lot of changes, and we need a lot of things that have been around for a while to change or just to collapse, and be built anew. And so in that way, I sort of welcome these things. And I guess that's my pro and con from the COVID era. They are new opportunities, and like you're saying, I think a lot of it's just, we just continue to go on. We continue to seek God together, seek to serve the communities around us together. And, I know for our church, not in some ways not a lot changed. I mean, we're still baptizing people throughout pandemic. We're still seeing people come to Christ. We're still, growing together. We're still seeking things, and and so, like you're saying, let's just keep going, and let's just run that much more with that much more clarity. Just run with endurance. Yeah.
I mean, to your compound question, I guess the first part I think is maybe use an analogy. So sometimes some of my kids, they're all very proactive, and sometimes they complain to me, Dad, how come I always have to be the one who plan for events among my friends? So they were complaining to me about their friends, right? And I usually my response to them is, on one hand, try to be sympathetic, Dad, right? I'm so sorry that you feel that way, that you feel like everybody else is not being proactive and your friends are not looking for you. You have to go look for them and so on. On the other hand, I say, well, but maybe God gifted you that way, because I asked him or her, when you do that, do your friends respond? She says, oh yeah, they always respond. They love when I coordinate plans. I said, well, maybe God gifted you and give you leadership, and the fact that they're responding, it's not like they're ignoring you. They're responding to your gathering them together in community and do things, right? So don't see that as a complaint. How come you have to do it all, but you get to do it, and God has called you to do it. So maybe God gave you the leadership to do it. So in the same way, when there's that gap between the congregation and the pastor, I remind myself and the staff, okay, we who are in the leadership position can't wait for the congregation to be proactive, and we also don't want to guilt trip them into proactive. So let's be proactive in reaching out to them, care for them, communicate with them, and share with them how we feel too, right? And then kind of relate to that, to your second part question, I think, again, try not to be oversimplified, but I think back to our theme, right? So when crises come, right, typically it either cause you to be just like chicken with their head cut off and trying to grasp at straws, or really help you to focus, And so we as a leadership, we want ourselves, but also help our congregation to focus on what really is important. Going back to the gospel, going back to Jesus. I know it sounds cliche that at church anything, just say Jesus and you're 50% the right, your answer to the question, right? But in our case, really, when we thought about the Christ alone theme, like for me, reflecting on it, we had gone through a lot of other crises, personal family crisis, mental health crisis. One of my daughters was hospitalized. In fact, she and I was just in Atlanta speaking about her experience, and now that God has brought her through it. But we've gone through a lot, but I think in the pandemic had really forced me in a good way to, first myself, to really fall in love with Jesus even more. And just when we say Jesus is important, we say the gospel is important. Well, just how important really is he when everything falls apart or push comes to shove, right? And I found that Jesus holds up, more than holds up, and I'm in love with him more than I ever was, right? And then at the same time, his purpose, his mission didn't change, right? So the thing that we kept preaching and teaching and modeling to our people, and I think for a word of encouragement is that, the world is complicated. There are many complicated issues, but at the end of the day, it's sort of you center on the gospel. Then from the gospel, you look at racial issues. From the gospel, you look at other issues instead of gospel just one of the issues. So I think we just really keep preaching and modeling, enjoying the presence of Jesus, and then carrying out the purpose of Jesus. And everything else, let it fall where it may. So
That's good. This is such a rich conversation. We could have gone hours. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared, for the ministry, and for the ways in which you continue to persevere and serve your community so well, and really bear witness as Asian American pastors and leaders. And thanks for joining us at the table.